In the 3rd year after her son's death, Marcia of Rome still kept his room as he had left it, and still refused every friend who came to speak of consolation. Her father, Cordus, had starved himself to death under Tiberius. Her son Metilius had died young, and grief in her house had taken on the appearance of loyalty. It was into this house, at last, that a letter arrived from a man she had known only by reputation, opening with a sentence that must have struck her as impertinence itself. "If I did not know, Marcia, that you were as far removed from womanish weakness of mind as from all other vices, and that your character was regarded as a model of the ancient virtues, I should not dare to assail your grief." He does not begin by softening the ground. He does not begin by saying he understands. He begins by naming, without apology, what he intends to do. He intends to assail her grief. He intends to interrupt it. The letter that follows will run to some 26 chapters. It will invoke history and philosophy and the deaths of children in the houses of the greatest Romans of the previous century. It will move, at its climax, into a vision of the heavens in which Marcia's father speaks to her from among the stars. But before any of that, the writer must justify a strange and audacious premise that after 3 years of a mother's mourning, it is not only permissible but necessary for a stranger to say, "Enough." This is the consolation to Marcia. The writer is Lucius Annius Seneca, and the principle he is defending against every instinct of tenderness that a listener might bring to it is that grief has no natural term, and that consolation, if it is to do its work, must interrupt. Let us reflect on what Seneca is claiming. He is not claiming that grief is wrong. He is not claiming that Marcia's love for her son was excessive, or that a mother ought to endure the death of a child with dry eyes. Seneca, who had lost his own son in infancy, who would later lose friends to Nero's suspicions and eventually his own life to Nero's command, was not a man who thought sorrow beneath the philosopher. What he claimed was something more precise and more difficult. He claimed that grief, left to itself, does not exhaust itself. This is the observation upon which the entire Consolation rests, and it is worth pausing to hear it in his own words. "Time," he writes, "which mitigates the fiercest sorrows and subdues even the heaviest, has no power over you alone." Time, he means, has failed. He has watched Marcia for 3 years. Time, which the mourners around her have counted on to do its quiet work, has done nothing. Her grief in the 3rd year is not smaller than her grief in the 1st. It has become, instead, a kind of dwelling. She has moved into it. She has furnished it. She has, in some quiet way that she may not even be aware of, refused to leave. And so Seneca proposes that the ordinary theory of grief, the theory implicit in every gentle friend who has waited for her to recover, is mistaken. The ordinary theory holds that sorrow is a wound, and that wounds heal, and that one must simply wait. Seneca observes that this is not what has happened. Some griefs do heal on their own, others do not. Others, unattended, calcify. They become the shape of a life. And when this has happened, kindness, the kindness of silence, the kindness of leaving the mourner alone with her sorrow, is no longer kindness. It has become collusion. Consolation, then, in Seneca's understanding, is not the offering of soft words at the appropriate moment, 6 weeks or 6 months after the funeral, when the mourner is ready to hear them. Consolation is an act. It is an interruption. It is a friend or a philosopher standing at the door of the grief house and refusing to leave until the mourner comes out. It is sometimes saying what no one else will say. It is telling Marcia, in the 3rd year of her sorrow, that her son has been dead for 3 years and that her father would not have wished her to continue. The Latin word he uses throughout is consolatio, from which our word consolation descends, but the Latin carries a weight our word has lost. Consolare means to strengthen, to fortify, to bring alongside. It is not the murmured comfort of the sick room. It is the arm placed under the elbow of one who has stopped walking. Consolation, for Seneca, is a form of philosophical assistance offered to a friend who has, without knowing it, given up. We are told, in the letter, that Marcia was the daughter of Cordus, the historian who had written admiringly of Brutus and Cassius, and who, under Tiberius, had been prosecuted for it. Rather than face condemnation, Cordus had refused food and died in his own house. Marcia, we are told, had preserved his books after Sejanus had ordered them burned. She was a woman then, of extraordinary courage, of philosophical formation, of moral independence. She was not a fragile personality. She was the sort of Roman woman that Roman moralists praised, and this, Seneca implies, is precisely why he can write to her as he does. To understand why Seneca dared such a letter, one must consider where he was and what he had lately endured when he took up his pen. The Consolation to Marcia was composed in the reign of the Emperor Claudius, though scholars debate whether Seneca wrote it before or after his own exile. What is certain is that Seneca in this period was a man acquainted with reversal. He had been born in Cordoba, in Roman Spain, sometime around the year we now call 4 before the Common Era. His father, Seneca the Elder, was a teacher of rhetoric of some reputation, and had brought the boy to Rome for his education. There the young Seneca had studied under the Stoic Attalus and the philosopher Socian, and had for a time followed the Pythagorean practice of vegetarianism, until his father, worried about the strangeness of it, persuaded him to abandon the habit. He had entered public life. He had risen. Under Caligula, he had come close enough to imperial displeasure that the emperor was said to have contemplated his execution, and to have refrained only because a woman of the court whispered that Seneca was consumptive and would die shortly on his own. He did not die. He survived Caligula, and then in the year 41 of the Common Era, under Claudius, he was accused of adultery with the emperor's niece, Julia Livilla, and was banished to the island of Corsica. He would remain on Corsica for 8 years. We do not know precisely what those 8 years were like for him, but he has left us traces. Corsica, in the 1st century, was not a resort. It was a wooded, mountainous island, sparsely populated, considered by Roman writers to be barbarous. Seneca wrote of it that it grew nothing kindly and welcomed no one. He wrote, in another consolation composed there, of the strangeness of the language of its inhabitants, of the harshness of its climate, of the silence. He was a man who had lived at the center of the Roman world, in a city of 1 million people, at the elbow of emperors, and he had been sent to a rock in the Tyrrhenian Sea and told he might die there. It was in this period, or just before it, or shortly after his return, that he wrote to Marcia. Consider, then, the position from which he wrote. He was not a man consoling from safety. He was, or had recently been, a man in his own kind of grief, the grief of a public life ended, of children lost, of reputation stained. His own son had died shortly before his exile. He had been separated from his mother, Helvia, to whom he addressed another consolation, urging her not to mourn his banishment as though he were dead. He knew the interior of the grief house. He had lived in one himself. And this, one must consider, is the difference between the consolation of a man who has never suffered and the consolation of a man who has. Seneca does not stand outside Marcia's sorrow and pity her from a distance. He stands inside a sorrow of his own and calls to her across the wall. What he says to her, he has had occasion to say to himself. The letter, when he writes it, opens with an unusual gambit. He does not begin with his own arguments. He begins by reminding Marcia of another woman, Octavia, the sister of the Emperor Augustus, who had lost her son Marcellus and had mourned him without limit for the rest of her life. Octavia, Seneca writes, avoided all mention of her son. She hated all mothers and was inflamed most of all against Livia, because the happiness which had once been promised to her own son seemed to have passed over to Livia's. She refused every consolation. She wore mourning until her death, and Seneca sets against her another figure, Livia, the wife of Augustus, who lost her son Drusus and, after a period of proper mourning, resumed her life, spoke his name, kept his memory as a friend rather than as a wound. He offers Marcia these two women. He asks her which of them she resembles. He asks her which of them she wishes to resemble. This is not gentle. It is not what a modern grief counselor would say. It is, however, precisely what a Stoic philosopher believed himself required to say, because Seneca believed that Marcia was a rational being, and that rational beings could be reasoned with, and that to speak to her as though she could not bear reason was itself a kind of insult. Let us now consider how the principle actually functions in the letter, because it is one thing to name it and another to see it worked out. Seneca proceeds, after the comparison of Octavia and Livia, to the great catalogue of Roman deaths. He reminds Marcia that Lucius Sulla lost a son, that Pulvillus lost a son at the very moment he was dedicating a temple and did not interrupt the ceremony, that Paulus, on the day of his triumph, buried two sons and did not fail to appear on the Capitol, that Julius Caesar heard of his daughter's death while campaigning and returned to his work within days. He is not, one must understand, holding these men up as examples of coldness. He is holding them up as examples of a certain proportion. He is saying to Marcia, these were people who loved their children as you loved your son, and who nevertheless found that their grief had a shape and a limit and a proper place in a life that had other duties. He then turns to what one might call the philosophical center of the letter. He asks Marcia to consider the nature of what she has lost. Her son, he reminds her, was mortal from the moment of his birth. You knew that your son was mortal when you brought him into the world, he writes, and you brought him up as a mortal. Nothing in his death, therefore, was a violation of the terms under which he had lived. The universe did not break its promise to Marcia. It fulfilled the only promise it had ever made. This is a hard doctrine. It is not a doctrine that a grieving mother welcomes. Seneca knows this. He does not soften it. He proceeds to say that all of us, every person in the world, is subject to the same terms, that the wealth of the household, the health of the children, the affection of a spouse, the standing of the family, all of these are on loan, and the term of the loan has never been specified in advance. What is given may be recalled at any moment. This is not cruelty on the part of the universe. It is simply the condition of being a mortal thing among mortal things. And here, one must consider, is the pivot on which the entire Stoic project turns. It is not that grief is forbidden. It is that grief, prolonged past the point where it does its work, has become a protest against the nature of reality itself. To grieve for 3 years is to say, in effect, I did not agree to these terms. I will not accept that my son was mortal. I will remain in mourning until the universe reverses itself. And the universe, of course, will not. So the grief house becomes, over time, a house of protest. And the mourner, over time, becomes a woman shaking her fist at the sky. Seneca will not permit this. Not because he does not sympathize with the impulse, but because he believes that no life can be lived from that posture, and that Marcia has too much life still in her to spend it there. Toward the end of the letter, he offers her the vision I mentioned earlier. He imagines her father, Metilius Cordus, now among the blessed, speaking down to her. The passage is long and beautiful, and it is one of the finest things Seneca ever wrote. Cordus tells her that her son is with him, that neither of them is lost, that the world she calls solid is in fact the shadow, and the world of the spirits is the substance. He tells her, in Seneca's voice, that all the great civilizations of the past are gone, that Rome itself will one day be gone, that the earth itself will one day be dissolved in fire, and that in the vastness of this cosmic movement, one young man's death is not the aberration she has taken it for. It is a thread in a fabric so large she cannot see its edges. Whether Seneca believed this literally, whether he thought Cordus actually spoke, whether he held some doctrine of the survival of the soul, scholars have argued about this for centuries, and the letter is not entirely consistent with his other writings. What matters is the rhetorical function of the passage. Marcia is not being asked to accept a metaphysical proposition. She is being asked to enlarge the frame within which she views her loss. She has been staring at her son's empty room for 3 years. Seneca lifts her gently and turns her toward the sky. The letter ends. Seneca has said what he came to say. He does not know whether Marcia will receive it. He does not know whether she will emerge from her grief house or whether she will burn the letter and never speak his name. He has done what a friend or a philosopher can do. He has interrupted. We are told that Marcia lived on for many years after this letter, and that she was in her later life respected in Rome as a woman of dignity. We do not know whether Seneca's words reached her. We know only that the letter survived and that it has done in the 18 centuries since, whatever work it has done in the private grief of readers whose names we do not know. What then is the structural lesson? What is Seneca actually teaching beneath the specifics of Marcia and her son and the deaths of Roman consuls? He is teaching this. There is a common belief that grief is a natural process, that it moves on its own timetable, and that the role of others is to wait quietly on the periphery until the mourner has finished. Seneca, observing carefully, denies the premise. He observes that grief does not always finish, that some griefs, left alone, become permanent, that the failure of others to speak is not always kindness, that it is sometimes only fear. Fear of the mourner, fear of the awkwardness of the intervention, fear of appearing to have moved on more quickly than one should. The Stoic contribution, then, is this reframing. Consolation is not passive. It is not the sending of a card. It is a philosophical act undertaken by a friend on behalf of a mourner who has begun to lose the capacity to console herself. It requires that the friend be willing to say the difficult thing. It requires that the friend be willing to appear in the moment to lack sympathy. It requires courage. It requires love of a stern kind. One must consider what this implies for how we think of friendship. The friend who says nothing, who lets the mourner mourn indefinitely, who never questions the duration or the depth of the sorrow, may seem the more delicate friend. Seneca would say, this friend is the less useful one. This friend is, in a way, absent. This friend has left the mourner alone in the grief house, has closed the door softly, and has walked away out of a mistaken respect for the mourner's pain. But the mourner did not need to be left alone. The mourner needed someone to knock. There is a second lesson, and it is harder. The lesson concerns not the friend, but the mourner herself. Seneca is arguing that the mourner has a duty. He does not put it this way because he is too skilled a rhetorician to say to a grieving mother that she is failing in an obligation. But it is the logic of the letter. Marcia has a duty to her father's memory, which was one of courage. She has a duty to her surviving children and to her household and to the city in which she lives. She has a duty to herself, to the philosophical formation she received, to the woman she was before her son died. Grief that is honored past its work is a failure of these duties. It is the choice, made silently and without acknowledgement, to prefer sorrow to responsibility. This is a claim modern ears may resist. We have learned to speak of grief as sacred, as unassailable, as owed to the beloved dead. Seneca does not deny that grief is owed. He denies only that infinite grief is owed. The love a mother bears her son does not require and is not honored by a life given wholly to mourning. The son, if he could speak, would not ask this of her. Cordus, if he could speak, would not ask this of her. The gods, if they attend to such things, do not ask this of her. The wise man knows, Seneca would say, that our loves in this life are gifts held for a term we did not set. When the term ends, we grieve. Grief is proper, but grief, honored past its function, becomes a refusal of the gift itself. To have loved fully is to have received the gift fully. To mourn forever is to say the gift should not have been given at all. And this, at last, is why Seneca dared to write to Marcia 3 years after her son's death. He was not correcting a woman who had suffered too long. He was returning to her the memory of a son whom she was, without meaning to, beginning to lose again, this time by refusing to let him be anything other than the source of her pain. Her son had been more than that. He had been a person, a life, a joy. 3 years of unbroken mourning had begun to make him only a wound. Seneca wrote to give him back to her as a memory rather than a wound. Consolation, then, is not the diminishment of the beloved dead. It is the restoration of the beloved dead to their proper place in a life that continues. Let us close. You may find, at some hour of your own life, that you are in the position of Marcia, or you may find that you are in the position of the friend who has waited 3 years and said nothing, or you may find, as most of us do at one time or another, that you are in both positions, in different parts of your life, at once. Seneca does not offer a formula. He does not tell you how long is long enough, or how one knows when consolation is needed, or what words to use. These are questions the philosopher leaves with the reader, because they cannot be answered in advance. They must be met in the specific case, with the specific mourner, in the specific silence that has begun to grow too long. What he offers is only the principle, that grief has no natural term, that some griefs, left alone, do not resolve. That consolation, when it is truly consolation, is an act of interruption undertaken by a friend on behalf of a person who has begun to prefer her sorrow to her life. That this interruption may feel, to the mourner and to the friend alike, like a violation, and that it is, nevertheless sometimes, the last and most necessary form of love a friend can offer. The letter to Marcia is a letter that no one asked for. It arrived in her house without invitation. It said things she had spent 3 years refusing to hear. It was, by every ordinary measure of politeness, an intrusion. It was also, quite possibly, the only thing that saved her. Consider then this question as you go from this hour into whatever the rest of your day contains. Is there someone in your life whom you have permitted, out of respect or fear or delicacy, to remain too long in a sorrow they have begun to inhabit? And if there is, what would it cost you to write the letter? What would it cost them if you did not? Seneca wrote his letter, and it has survived for 2,000 years. Yours need not survive. It need only arrive. Farewell.